Alden had walked through 1,000 towns, lived 1,000 lives, and traded 1,000 moments, but there was something different about this one. The streets of the small, cobbled town stretched out before him in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. The buildings were old, their bricks worn and weathered, as though they'd seen centuries pass in mere moments. The quiet, unassuming nature of the place almost made him feel out of place. Time was not like this elsewhere. But here, it felt like time itself was at a standstill, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Alden adjusted the folds of his coat, which had once been a vibrant shade of midnight blue but had long since faded to the color of forgotten rain. He looked out over the town square, noting the idle chatter of the market vendors, the children running in circles, the laughter that seemed to echo through the streets, suspended in the air like the tick of a clock. And then, he saw him. The young man stood in the center of the square, leaning against a weathered lamppost with a carefree grin on his face, watching the world go by. His name was Julian, and though Alden had never met him before, there was a sense of familiarity that stirred deep within his chest. It was more than a coincidence, Alden knew that. He could feel it in the way the air around the young man seemed to bend and warp, as if time itself was subtly stretching and pulling in his presence. Alden squinted against the light, and then it hit him. Julian wasn't just a passerby. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was something else entirely. The young man's eyes met Alden's, and the corners of his lips curled into an easy, knowing smile. "You're lost, aren't you, old man?" Julian called out, his voice light and teasing, as if he'd known Alden for years. Alden stepped forward, his heart beating faster than it had in centuries. "Lost?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I'm never lost. I'm simply passing through." Julian grinned wider. "Sure you are. Just passing through like every other wanderer. But you don't look like the usual type." Alden chuckled, his voice gravelly with age. "What type do I look like, then?" "The type that knows things. You've got that look in your eyes, like you've seen 1,000 years or two. Or maybe more." Julian's gaze lingered on Alden, as if sizing him up, but there was a glimmer of something else there, recognition. Alden couldn't help but smile. The young man was perceptive, that much was clear. But what disturbed him more was the feeling that Julian wasn't as unaware of his nature as he appeared to be. The way the boy carried himself, as if he were in tune with time itself, told Alden that he wasn't just some ordinary youth. No, this was something else. Something he had hoped would never happen. "You're right," Alden said, his voice turning soft. "I have seen a lot of things. More than most could even imagine. And yet, here I am, in a town like this, where time seems to stand still." Julian raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "Sounds like you're looking for something. Or someone." Alden hesitated. "You could say that." The young man crossed his arms over his chest, studying him with an intensity that belied his casual demeanor. "You don't seem like the type to come all the way here by accident. Maybe, you were meant to find something, or maybe someone." There it was again. That unshakable feeling. Alden's heart tightened. He took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for the inevitable conversation. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Alden asked suddenly, his voice heavy with unspoken history. Julian looked confused. "Recognize you? What do you mean?" Alden stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "What if I told you that I knew you, in a way that no one else could? What if I told you that you are the reason I've walked through all these years, through all these towns, searching?" Julian blinked, then laughed. "You've got me confused with someone else, old man." But Alden could see the flicker of uncertainty in the young man's eyes. He had to push forward, now. He had to let the truth slip, even if it meant everything would change. "I am your father," Alden said flatly, watching as Julian's face shifted from amusement to confusion to disbelief. "Wait, what?" Julian's voice cracked as he took a step back. His eyes darted around, like he was looking for a way to escape the conversation, but there was nowhere to go. The square was empty now, save for the two of them. Alden didn't wait for a response. "I'm not here by chance, Julian. I've been looking for you for years. You are the result of a deal I made long ago, a deal that left you in this world, a part of me that I didn't know existed until now." Julian's face twisted into something between incredulity and anger. This is insane. You can't just walk up to me and claim you're my father, out of nowhere. I don't know you. I don't even. You've inherited my abilities, Alden interrupted, his voice cutting through the boy's denial like a knife. The ability to manipulate time. You don't understand it yet, but you will. You were born with it. Julian's mouth opened and closed in confusion. Time? What are you talking about? I can't do anything. I've never. Alden took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Julian's with the intensity of centuries of experience. You've never tried. You've never needed to. But trust me, it's there. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, in the way time seems to bend around you. You just don't know it yet. The air seemed to still around them, as if even the world itself were listening. Julian shook his head, clearly overwhelmed. You're insane. I don't even know who you are, and you're telling me I can control time? Alden chuckled softly, the sound like the rustling of old leaves. I wasn't always this old, you know. Time has a way of catching up with you, but I was once young, too. And I made deals with forces I didn't fully understand. One of those deals brought me to your mother, and from that night came you. But there's more, Julian. There's something you need to understand. Julian raised his hands in frustration. Okay, fine. Let's say you're telling the truth. You're my father. Big deal. What now? Alden looked up at the sky, where the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Now, you must face what I never did. You must defeat me, Julian, to truly control your destiny. There was a silence between them, broken only by the sound of distant wind chimes ringing softly in the breeze. What do you mean, defeat you? Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alden turned to face him fully, his eyes hardening with the weight of his own mistakes. To master time, you must first defeat the one who controls it. You must challenge me. Only by defeating me will you truly be free. Only then can you control your own fate. Julian took a step back, his eyes wide in disbelief. Wait. You're telling me I have to kill you? Alden shook his head slowly. No, not kill. But you must defeat me in a way that you can't yet understand. Time is not a weapon, Julian. It is a force, an unyielding power that must be respected. Julian's gaze shifted, his face a mix of emotions. The weight of the moment was sinking in. This was no joke, no elaborate scheme. Alden had just handed him the key to everything, and now he had to decide whether to accept it. Where do I even start? Julian muttered, more to himself than to Alden. You will find out soon enough, Alden replied, his voice filled with an odd mixture of resignation and pride. But be warned, Julian. Time is a tricky thing. It will test you. It will try to break you. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Alden could feel the inevitable pull of fate tugging at him, and he knew that this moment would change everything. Julian stared at Alden, his mind racing, his thoughts jumbled in a whirlwind of disbelief and curiosity. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, but he didn't know where to begin, where to even start to untangle the mess of time, fate, and bloodlines Alden had dropped into his lap. He wasn't even sure what it meant to defeat someone when it came to time, let alone his own father, someone who claimed to have lived for centuries. Alden's eyes never left him. There was no kindness in them, no warmth that could reassure Julian in this moment of utter confusion. What Alden was asking, no, demanding, was a challenge Julian didn't feel prepared for, but it wasn't like he had much of a choice. Why now? Julian finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly, his throat dry. Why come here? Why tell me all this? Because time's running out, Alden replied, the words simple but weighted with meaning. For both of us. I've spent too many years running from my own choices. I've danced around my mistakes for centuries, always manipulating time, never once stopping to consider the cost. And now, Alden's voice trailed off, the ancient weight of his words hanging in the air like dust. Julian shook his head, still struggling to process. I don't get it. You're saying I have to fight you, to control time? To take control of my life? Alden's lips curled into a faint, rueful smile. It's not about taking control, Julian. It's about understanding control. Time is not a gift. It's a burden, one that few can handle. You'll have to face it. But to face it, you have to face me first. Julian clenched his fists, eyes narrowing. He was angry now, angry at Alden, at himself for getting swept up in this mess. The pieces weren't fitting, and he hated how much it didn't make sense. But then again, when had his life ever made sense? What did he know of time, of power? He could barely control the clock in his own mind, let alone the shifting tides of time Alden was talking about. But something in his gut told him that Alden wasn't lying. It was too real, too personal to be a dream. This was his legacy, his inheritance. I can't just take you down, Julian said, more to himself than to Alden, frustration lining his voice. What does that even mean? You've got centuries of experience. I've got nothing. I can barely control my own damn life, let alone bend time to my will. Alden regarded him with an unsettling calmness. You think I started out knowing how to bend time? I was as lost as you are now. But time teaches you, Julian. It shows you what you need to know, when you're ready. Ready for what? Julian shot back, his voice rising. I'm supposed to defeat you and then what? Take control of time? How? How do you even do that? The first step, Alden said softly, is realizing that time isn't something you can control. Not in the way you think. It's not about bending it, about bending reality to your whims. Time is a reflection. A reflection of choices, of actions, of consequences. Julian looked at Alden, still trying to grasp the meaning of his words, but the more he thought about it, the more they seemed to make sense in a twisted way. Time, he'd always thought, was just the ticking of the clock. The linear march from birth to death, from one second to the next. But Alden was talking about something far deeper, far more intangible than anything Julian had ever considered. Okay, Julian said after a long pause. Say I do face you. What then? What happens to me? Alden's eyes softened, but only briefly. You'll learn the truth. And then, you'll have a choice. A choice that's been waiting for you. The words echoed in Julian's mind as he looked down at his hands. Was he truly ready for this? Could he even begin to comprehend what Alden was saying? The gravity of the situation was crushing him. But the truth was, he didn't have much of a choice. Time had already chosen for him. He was already caught in its web. Alden turned, his movements fluid and graceful despite his age, and began walking toward the edge of the square, where a narrow path led up into the hills surrounding the town. Julian hesitated for a moment, then followed, his steps slow and heavy as he tried to gather his thoughts. He couldn't escape this, couldn't ignore the truth of it. Whether he was ready or not, Alden's challenge hung over him like an ancient sword, ready to fall at any moment. As they walked, the world around them seemed to fall silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. The houses grew sparse, the cobblestones gave way to dirt paths, and the town disappeared behind them. The path curved upward, winding through trees whose gnarled branches seemed to reach for the sky like the fingers of the past itself. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and Julian's heart beat a little faster, a little harder. The further they went, the more the weight of Alden's words sank into him. He was walking toward something, toward the moment where he would either break free from time or be consumed by it. Finally, they reached the top of the hill, where a small, ancient temple stood. It looked like it had been here for centuries, its stone walls covered in ivy, the roof barely clinging to the frame. The air felt heavier here, as though the passage of time had settled into every crack, every crevice. It was a place of forgotten knowledge, a place where time itself seemed to bend and twist in ways Julian couldn't even begin to understand. Alden stopped at the entrance, looking back at Julian with a solemn expression. "This is where you will begin," he said. "Inside is the key to understanding time. To understanding yourself." Julian hesitated at the threshold. "What is it? What's inside?" Alden didn't answer at first. He simply looked at Julian, his gaze piercing, as though searching for something deep within him. "You're the one who will find out. But you must be prepared, Julian. What you learn here will change everything. Time is not a tool to be wielded. It is not something you control. It's something you learn to coexist with." Julian took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He had no idea what to expect, but there was no turning back now. With a final glance at Alden, he stepped into the temple. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and ancient stone. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, scrolls, and odd relics that seemed to pulse with an energy Julian couldn't quite understand. The dim light that filtered in through cracks in the stone illuminated symbols etched into the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change as his eyes moved across them. At the center of the room, a large pedestal stood, upon which rested a single object, a small, intricate hourglass. The sand inside was moving in a way that defied logic. Its flow was slow, then fast, then slow again, as though time itself were being played with. "This," Alden said, his voice echoing softly in the stone chamber, "is the heart of time. The hourglass is not just a tool. It is a reflection of your choices, Julian. The choices that have brought you here, the choices that will define your future. What you do with it is entirely up to you." Julian stood frozen, staring at the hourglass. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered just above it. The sand inside seemed to whisper to him, beckoning him to touch it, to understand it, but as his hand descended, the room began to tremble. The hourglass started to glow, its light growing brighter and brighter until it enveloped the entire room, blinding Julian. He felt his heart race, felt his body being pulled into the light, and then, time stopped. The world around him was frozen, every sound, every movement halted in mid-air. Julian's breath caught in his throat as he looked around. The hourglass had vanished, leaving only a faint glow where it had been, and then, out of the silence, a voice echoed in his mind, "You are ready." The voice was familiar, yet distant, like a memory he couldn't quite reach. It was Alden's voice, but something was different about it. There was power in it now, an ancient, unyielding force that seemed to transcend time itself. Julian's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that this moment, this silence, was not just a pause. It was a choice. It was the moment where everything would change, where he would either step forward into his destiny, or remain trapped in the endless cycle of time. As the voice faded, the world around him began to move again. Time resumed its relentless march. The question was no longer what would happen next. It was what he would do with the time he had left. He reached out for the hourglass once more. And this time, he was ready. The world around Julian seemed to hum with energy, the very air charged with the feeling of an ancient power being unleashed. The hourglass, now firmly in his hands, pulsed like a beating heart, its shifting sands beginning to settle into a rhythm of their own. For a moment, Julian could feel the weight of the world upon him. He could sense the pressure of the decisions that had led him here, of the moment he was now part of. The temple had changed. The stone walls seemed to grow, twisting upward as if they were alive, bending to the will of the hourglass. The symbols on the walls no longer seemed to shift, they were now fixed, frozen in place, as though they were part of the fabric of time itself. The air was thick with the sound of ticking, not from any clock, but from the very essence of the universe, time itself, moving, shifting, bending, that he could feel it now. He was inside it. He had crossed over. Alden stood before him, his figure no longer just an old man, but something more, a reflection of the immense power he had wielded for centuries. His eyes glowed with an eerie light, not of age, but of something deeper, something that had been shaped by millennia of experience. "You've done it," Alden said, his voice distant but clear. "You've taken the first step. But remember, Julian, the hourglass is only a reflection. It shows you what is, what was, and what could be. The question is, what will you do with it?" Julian's fingers tightened around the hourglass, the warmth of the sand pressing against his skin. It felt right, almost as though the object itself had been waiting for him. He could feel its power calling to him, urging him to make a choice. The choice that had always been his, but one he had never truly understood until now. "Why me?" Julian asked, his voice shaking. "Why did you leave me here? Why didn't you?" Alden's expression softened, his gaze filled with something resembling regret. "Because I couldn't control it, Julian. Time is too vast, too dangerous for one person to wield alone. I made mistakes. I thought I could control it, could bend it to my will. But I was wrong. And in the end, the one who could stop me, who could set things right, was you." Julian swallowed, his heart pounding. The weight of Alden's words pressed upon him like an anchor. "So this was all planned?" Alden nodded, slowly. "In a way. Not everything, of course. But time has a way of shaping events, guiding us toward certain moments. And you were always meant to find this place, this hourglass. To understand what I couldn't." Julian felt a chill crawl down his spine as he realized the gravity of Alden's admission. He had been part of something much larger than himself, something that had been set into motion long before he even understood what it meant to live. His life, his very existence, had been tied to a force he could barely comprehend. "You're saying I have to?" Julian's words faltered, his throat tight with fear. "What happens if I fail? If I can't do this?" Alden looked at him with the kind of sadness Julian had never seen in his eyes before. "Then time will continue as it always has. The cycle will never break. The mistakes I made will carry on, and you will be left to watch as everything repeats itself." The thought of it, living through the same mistakes over and over again, sent a shiver of dread through Julian. He didn't want that. He didn't want to be trapped, bound by a fate he couldn't escape. But there was no turning back now. He had already stepped into this world, already made the choice to hold the hourglass. "I don't know if I can do this," Julian admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Alden stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to do it alone. You never did." At those words, Julian felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the weight of time bearing down on him, it was the realization that he wasn't alone in this. Alden had set the stage, but Julian had the power to change the outcome. He didn't have to follow in his father's footsteps. He could make his own path. The temple began to fade, the walls blurring, the light around them shifting as though the very fabric of reality were starting to unravel. Julian felt himself being pulled, not violently, but with a quiet insistence. The hourglass began to glow brighter, and before he could fully process what was happening, the world around him fractured. When the world reformed around Julian, it was no longer the temple, nor the town square. It was a strange, unrecognizable place, a landscape where time itself seemed to collapse in on itself. The sky above them wasn't the warm, soft blue he had known. Instead, it was a shifting canvas, streaked with vibrant colors that bled into each other like the remnants of a forgotten dream. Alden stood beside him, his figure flickering like an image on a broken film reel. "Welcome to the place between moments," he said, his voice strangely distant. "Here, you can see what might be, what could have been. But it is not yet real. It is still in the making." Julian looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The landscape seemed to shift with every blink, as if the world were in constant flux. Where are we? What is this place? This is the edge of time, Alden replied. It is the space between moments, the place where all possibilities exist. It is here that you will learn to understand time, not as a straight line, but as a web of potential. Everything you have seen, everything you will see, exists here. Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. He had no idea what Alden meant, but he knew one thing for certain: this was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The very ground beneath him seemed to pulse with energy, with a force he couldn't begin to comprehend. Time isn't a straight path, Alden continued, his voice like a whisper in the wind. It's a series of threads, weaving in and out of one another, pulling at each other. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything can change. The question is, Julian, what will you do with this power? Julian swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Alden's words settle into him. It wasn't just about defeating his father, about overcoming the challenge laid out before him. It was about understanding time itself. About learning to weave those threads together, to pull them in the direction he wanted. But that power came with consequences. He couldn't deny it any longer. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Julian confessed, his voice small in the vastness of the shifting landscape. I don't even know where to begin. Alden smiled, a rare moment of warmth in his expression. That's the first step, Julian. Recognizing that you're not ready, that's what makes you ready. Time doesn't wait for anyone. It is not something you control. It is something you become. Julian's heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the hourglass in his hand. The sands were almost gone, the end near. He knew that whatever happened next, whatever choice he made, would alter the course of everything. What happens when it's all gone? Julian asked, his voice barely audible. Then you choose, Alden said simply. The world around them began to shimmer, the landscape shifting once again. Julian felt the sands of the hourglass fall through his fingers, slipping away with every passing moment. And as they did, he realized that this was it. The moment where everything would change. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. And with that step, time began to bend to his will.